We are joined again by Professor Lauren Heller, who is presenting a lecture titled Government Failure in the Era of COVID-19, Can Liberalism Save Us? Professor Heller.
Thank you, Jason, and welcome back, everyone. I'm excited to be here on this last day and sort of wrapping up some of the themes we've talked about all week. So today, here's the basic thesis of my talk today, okay? So we've seen earlier, at least in my first lecture and other places, that markets and individual freedom more generally have come under lots of fire in the age of COVID-19, right? But another thing that's come under fire today that I want to talk about are deficiencies in unfettered government power, right? And so I want to think about what lessons we can learn from these contemporary challenges. What responses have we been seeing to the pandemic, right? In order to help us build a more healthier, peaceful world, right? So that's the basic idea. It's sort of thinking about what's the good news that we can take out of all of this. We'll start with some bad news and then we'll go on to the good. So here's the bad news, right, that we talked about in my first lecture. It's the idea that there's market failures, right, that are potentially attributable to markets. I know that seems repetitive, but we're going to contrast that with market failures that are potentially attributable to government. So we've discussed market failures that could potentially be attributable to markets themselves, right? Things about a market intrinsically that might lead to some problems that we would worry about, right? Both negative and positive externalities, potential public good provision, things like that. And we saw examples in the Tuesday's lecture about how that we might see modern challenges to markets evolve from this COVID-19 pandemic. But, right, here's what we haven't talked about yet in a lot of depth. What about market, quote unquote, failures that are actually potentially attributable to government instead of markets? I think markets sometimes get blamed for things that have nothing to do with individual market exchange. Also, if we buy the first argument that there are market failures that are potentially attributable to markets, then what would government's response be? And how could we critically analyze government in the same way that we just critically analyzed markets, right? So if we're going to look at markets from both sides of the coin, positive and potential negatives of markets, we better do the same thing for government to be intellectually honest with ourselves, right? It's not like we can say, hey, markets have these failures, no problem, government will solve it, right? And just like a genie sort of say, fixed it, right? It doesn't quite work that way. So we're going to talk about both these things. So let's start first with market failures that are potentially attributable to government. And a classic one is this lack of competition. So we typically see lack of competition illustrated as a potential market failure, right? Economists love competition for good reason, right? We want anybody that can potentially be buying a good to be allowed to buy it. We want people to be selling a good to sell it and to be competing with each other over providing for others through the market. And so when we see a lack of competition, right, we'll see fewer quantities produced than is socially optimal, right? So I want you to think of it similar to when we sort of talked about Pigouvian responses to externalities, right? We have some social optimal amount of this good and service that we might not be able to see, right? It might be a unicorn, but if we have a lack of competition, fewer quantities will be produced. And so this is sort of a traditional supply and demand graph that we might see. So this might be the ideal. In this case, I'm starting with the ideal, right? So this is the competitive supply and demand curve that you would normally observe in a market, but thanks to some restricted supply somewhere or another, we see restrictions on that. And so some classic examples of a lack of competition in markets might be through something like oil production, things that might have quote unquote natural monopolies, which always cracks me up. There's nothing really natural about them, but electricity provision, water provision, things like that. Now, often we see markets blamed for lack of competition, right? So you hear about in history things like oil barons, right, and other responses. But if you look at those two examples below, at least in contemporary times, what do you notice about both of those things, right? Both of those things have a lot more to do with governments than have to do with markets, right? So OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, right? So these are countries that are getting together and deciding to restrict competition in the oil marketplace, right? To keep prices higher than we'd otherwise want, right? Utilities, last time I checked, we don't have a whole lot of competition in utility markets. Utility markets really highly regulated by government, often particularly with utilities like water. If you don't like the government provision of your water service, you're out of luck, right? Sometimes you see a little bit of competition in natural gas and things, but it's still so highly regulated that it's nothing like what we would want in a sort of competitive ideal market. But so we see this lack of competition. Where do we see it? Other places. We've saw it in the wealth and poverty lecture. When I talked about occupational regulation is something that holds the poor back, right? And so here's an article from the Huffington Post about a hair braider writing about her struggle for hair braiding freedom, right? And so what happens in a market like this? As Smith said, never do two people essentially gather in a room except for a contrivance to raise prices, right? So who might want hair braiders to be licensed? Well, of course, cosmetologists, right, are going to band together and be on the cosmetology boards using the levers of government to restrict competition in the market. It would be much harder for cosmetologists to prevent entry by hair braiders in a market, right, if it weren't for that lever of government holding them back, right? So when we see government tools used for this all of the time. And so how can we see this market failure, actually government failure, in the response to COVID-19? Well, guys, you can see it everywhere. So here's an article from the June issue of Reason, but actually they come out earlier than that. And it's about responses in February and March. Ron Bailey's the science editor for Reason. And he has a great article about how back in February and March, tons of red tape made it so that coronavirus tests were unable to come out in the US compared to countries like South Korea, who were much faster on the uptake. And then essentially a lot of FDA regulations and other things really prevented us from testing effectively. And as a result, because private solutions weren't available, the pandemic became much worse than would otherwise have been the case. And in fact, so contrast that, right, with an article from June 6th, right? So this is less than a week ago that the FDA has just authorized a portable 15-minute coronavirus test. There's lots of reasons why you would want really quick responses in a pandemic, accurate responses, but really quick responses in a pandemic for a test like coronavirus, right? So if people do need to quarantine or something like that, you need to know quickly so they don't go around infecting others, right? And just now we're getting tests thanks to finally relaxing of lots of these FDA regulations that other countries were able to do a whole lot earlier, right? And as a result, we're just getting things now and it's really too little too late. Right? So in this case, this is a great example of how government regulation can kill people, right? So maybe you don't think about this with respect to the coronavirus. Maybe you think it's, especially for younger people, only something like a flu. But this FDA authorization is visible now, right? But it always is in the background, right? So there's tons of FDA regulations that prevents things like chemotherapy treatments from getting on the market, that life-saving treatments from getting out in the first place. And as a result of, I mean, I could go off for an hour about the FDA, but as a result of that, people die, right, that otherwise wouldn't from not having access to medications. So we need to talk about this as a significant consequence. And so what else? So these are potential market failures potentially attributable to government, but what about government failures overall? And so for that, I think we need to go back, and for some of you, the economists in the room, this will be a little bit of a refresher. From some of you that are in maybe more traditional graduate programs that don't have a public choice emphasis, this might be somewhat new to you, all right? But let's be real for a second, right? So I think we've all discussed, at least in graduate school, that Santa Claus isn't real, right? However, if you think about how we think about Santa Claus, that's a lot of how we think about American democracy, right? When you guys were young, if you were born in this country, right, you know, from pre-K on up, right, your class stood up, you said your pledge allegiance to the flag, and you were told that nothing is better than American democracy, right? And if you didn't like American democracy, well, then there was just something wrong with you, right? God, apple pie, and American democracy, not sure in that order, right? So the idea of critiquing democracy feels strange, I think, to a lot of people, right? But just like as we grow up, we learn that Santa Claus isn't real, right? We have to grow up and realize that American democracy is probably not all it's cracked up to be as well, right? A true story, guys, my mother would be angry at me for giving this talk to you guys, right? She was the one that took me to the polls and, right, gave me voting stickers and is all about this. She's a poll worker now, like in her retirement, right? So, but these are the things I think we need to be real about. It doesn't mean that we can't have really good conversations about those things and relative to alternatives and things like that, but we need to be real about it. And so how I want to be real is applying the tools of economics to the study of the political process. So using economics as a lens, right, through which to view voters, politicians, and the democratic process. So if I'm going to do that and use sort of supply and demand tools, I'm going to look at voters as consumers. So economists believe, as a matter of principle, that voters, like anyone else, are self-interested. Right? So the argument's essentially, people are self-interested, voters are people, therefore voters are self-interested. It doesn't mean they're necessarily bad people, right? It just means that they're people. It means that when we walk into the voting booth, that we don't shed all personal incentives and think about the public welfare, right? And so what are they going to do? They're going to support candidates who they believe will provide them with the most services and benefits after accounting for personal costs. I have a confession to make, guys. I'm an economist, right? And someone that believes in markets a whole lot and knows all of this stuff about government inefficiency. Guys, I voted and was really excited about voting for a dog park in my hometown, okay? And I was really into it. I had 2 dogs when I moved to Rome, Georgia, and there just wasn't a dog park. And guys, they were gonna fund this dog park with a SPLOST, which is a special purpose local option sales tax in Georgia, which if you know anything about economics, or if you're into economics, grad students, sales taxes tend to be pretty regressive, right? They tend to tax the poor at a higher rate than they tax the wealthy because the poor spend a higher percentage of their income on consumption goods. Right? And so they're going to use this regressive tax, right, to fund something to fund tennis courts, right? By the way, around town, public tennis courts and a tennis center and a dog park. Now let's think about this for a second. I'm an economist that's interested in wealth and poverty issues particularly, right? I know that the inefficiencies of taxes more generally and sales taxes on the poor very specifically. And I am willing to vote. First of all, I'm willing to vote, which, right, they're running joke among many economists are, you voted, right? We're not mad at you for voting for the dog park, we're mad at you for voting, right? But I voted in order, right, to use a regressive tax, right, to fund a dog park, right? Something that would tax the poor disproportionately, essentially to subsidize wealthy people, right? Poor folks aren't using dog parks very often. Poor folks aren't using tennis centers, right, very often. But I was willing to do that. Why? I was a self-interested voter, right? I use this example not because it has particular relevance for you, but I use this example because I think it's always important to pick on the people in the room, right? It's very easy for us to say, oh, those people over there, they're so dumb, they're so silly, right? We can discount that argument. But if we're going to take arguments seriously, I think we need to look ourselves in the mirror and look at our own behaviors as voters in a democracy. Okay, so let's talk about this idea of rational ignorance, okay? That is often what makes a lot of people uncomfortable when we talk about public choice. Here's the basic idea. True fact, right? An estimated 137 million people voted in the last presidential election, right? And by a close margin, this guy won, okay? And this is him on election day, right? Accepting the presidential office, okay? But given that, right? Given that 137 million people voted in the last presidential election, right? The probability that any one individual's vote actually swung the election is infinitesimally small, right? Sure, there is a probability that exists out there, but it tends really, really, really close towards zero. A vote is like a lottery ticket, right? There's a chance, but it's a super small chance. So as a result, right, because people recognize at some level that their vote is unlikely to swing an election one way or another, they are very unlikely to use their precious time, right, to research alternative candidates and ideas well, right? So they are unlikely to know what a particular candidate's policy is, why, right? And it's rational in some sense, right? If you know your vote's not going to matter, essentially, right? Why look stuff up? Right? So as a result, think about this. What do campaign signs look like? Are there really nuanced political positions on campaign signs, right? Absolutely not, right? You can take any campaign sign you think about and look what they all look like, right? Last name for district court judge. Right? There's no, they're usually red and blue and patriotic and things, right? But there's never any nuanced positions on anything, right? Why? They recognize as voters that we are driving by on the highway at 50 miles an hour doing everything else in the world. They're just going for name recognition, right? There's no actual understanding of policies involved, right? And this is not saying that voters are idiots. In some way, it's saying voters are smart, right? Like they recognize their vote's not going to matter. It takes time, right? Researching alternative positions is costly, right? For very little benefit. So as rational individuals, if they're weighing marginal benefits and marginal costs, they're just not doing it. So politicians recognize this, right? They want to win elections. So as a result, right, profits motivate market entrepreneurs in some sense, right? They want to win your dollar. Politicians want to win your vote. So they recognize they've got these rationally uninformed voters and that they have to be convinced to want a candidate, right? And not with lots of nuance, right? So what happens as a result? Sometimes democracy can work okay when the benefits are fairly either widespread or concentrated, and those costs are fairly widespread or concentrated, right? The same people paying for the good are the same people receiving benefits from the good in the form of voting, right? Just like markets tend to work pretty well when the same people paying for a good are the same people receiving benefits from them, right? When do we run into trouble with markets? Maybe, right, when we have external costs, right, or external benefit. Same kind of thing here, right? So a special interest issue is an issue that generates really big personal benefits for a small group of people, but the costs are dispersed, right, among everybody else. And so an example of that might be the dog park that I just talked to you guys about, right? So I recognized that that dog park was going to generate pretty big personal benefits for me. I had 2 dogs and they need to run, right? But the cost dispersed on everybody else was pretty small, right? So the dog park was pretty expensive for a dog park, right? But as a result, it raised other folks' taxes by a small amount in the grand scheme of things. So while I was willing to vote for the dog park, other folks were rationally uninformed about it, and they didn't have incentive to research alternative issues or how much this was going to cost them. A similar example, because I remember I liked picking on people in the room, is the Georgia Hope Scholarship, where I'm from. So many states have scholarships like this. Florida has one. Lots of states sort of subsidize higher education, and lots of graduate students are either direct or indirect beneficiaries from this. So the Hope Scholarship largely funds undergraduate students. It also funds pre-K programs. But as a result, both public universities in Georgia by a large margin, places like UGA and Georgia Tech, but to a smaller extent, private schools like mine, get big subsidies from Hope that are paid for with tax dollars, right? So technically the lottery funds the Hope Scholarship, but remember, right, money, there's an opportunity cost always to spending. If lottery money wasn't spent on the Hope Scholarship, it could be spent on anything else, including refunds to taxpayers. So taxpayers are paying for this, whether or not it's a lottery program or not. And what do we notice? So the Hope Scholarship is also paid for by the lottery, and lotteries are also regressive, right? The poor tend to spend a higher share of their income on lottery tickets and things than wealthier people. But who does the Hope Scholarship benefit? So this is an article from a few years back from a UGA publication. That's why it's the red and black. Those are UGA colors. And what they found in this infographic on the top is the percentage of students at each school receiving a Hope Scholarship, which is close to a full ride at a lot of these institutions. And these are all big schools, Georgia Tech, right? So look, 98% of students at Georgia Tech and UGA are receiving huge scholarships to attend, right? Look at the median household income, right? So the Hope Scholarship is intended to affect poorer folks and to make college education affordable. But what it's really doing is it's a transfer from poorer folks to wealthier folks, leaving out a lot of who it's intended to benefit. And we see, I could name a million policies just like this one. Why do we have that, right? Because voters, right, the students that benefit, to some extent the university employees that benefit, they are members of a special interest group, right? They are very likely to lobby for things like Hope Scholarship. And at least at one point in Georgia, there was talk of scaling back the benefits from the Hope Scholarship. And y'all, you should have seen Georgia students up in arms at the State House, other places, picketing, all kinds of stuff, right? But other folks were rationally uninformed about the implicit taxes that they were paying on the Hope Scholarship. Why? Right? They were rationally uninformed, and because of the nature of the Hope Scholarship as a special interest issue, these things were likely to be passed whether or not they were efficient. Okay. And so what are contemporary challenges from this, right? So the reason special interest issues are a problem, it might not be that we're not saying anything about the policy itself, whether it's efficient or not, though usually we can show inefficiencies from subsidies and taxes and many things like that. The problem is that politicians have a really strong incentive to favor the views of special interests, even if they're inefficient, right? So regardless of whether these policies are going to be efficient, they're going to be passed anyway. And a classic example or a contemporary challenge to do the theme of our course, are trade restrictions, right? So trade and Trump's trade war, right? There's several articles all about this, about how the trade restrictions that Trump implemented, yes, they caused poverty for many people. They made our economic situation worse, absolutely, before the pandemic. But in the era of COVID-19, Trump's trade wars make things even worse, right? So lots of articles about how the trade war made us less prepared to handle the crisis. Lots of PPE equipment, as it turns out, was made in China and other places, right? As a result of lots of tariffs on PPE equipment that were instituted a few years ago, long before the pandemic, all of a sudden, we weren't able to have as high of stocks of PPE. Hospitals didn't carry as much on hand, and hoping that eventually the tariffs would subside, right? As a result, and it says among the products, right, with those higher duties were thermometers, breathing masks, hand sanitizer, patient monitors, medical grade PPE, right? And at the time, it was warned, if this is going to be an important response in a public health emergency. Well, it turns out that we saw that now, right? There were hospitals that were without PPE equipment because they just weren't there, right? And so why are tariffs implemented? Well, they're a classic example of a special interest issue, right? Domestic producers, high cost usually producers of these things, have lots of incentive to lobby government for these types of things, right? But the increased costs are widespread among the population. It's also a classic example of Bastiat's seen and unseen, right? So we see the people that are potentially laid off at manufacturing plants, right? We don't see the unseen costs widespread among the whole population. We don't see, right, the single parent that's trying to buy shoes for her kids and has to pay more money, right, as a result of higher prices and tariffs, right? These are the things we don't see. We see in our sort of rational ignorance as voters, we see the protectionism, right, as a potential benefit. And the rise of populism, especially with regards to tariffs, is one of the more terrifying things that I've seen over the past few years as an economist. And so, right, this presents a real problem for us when we think about special interest groups. Another issue that we really want to talk about that you all have already asked me about in the Q&A, so I would love to have more of a conversation about this if you guys want, is this notion of rent-seeking behavior. Right? So this is any time individuals or interest groups are trying to restructure public policy to redistribute more income to themselves. It comes out of the idea of economic rents. So, and this is all the way back to the classical economists, Ricardo and whatnot. So rents are profits. It came from rent on land originally, but rents are profits above and beyond the normal level of profit that you would see in an economic market. Right? But in a free, or at least fairly free economic market, if you're making profits hand over fist and there's some nice, healthy competition, what happens? Other folks will come in and compete those profits away from you, right? If I'm making amazing profits selling cupcakes or something, right? And you see that I'm making those profits, I won't make it for long because somebody else can come in and make cupcakes, right? So I can only expect a normal level of profit. Well, rent-seeking behavior is when individuals lobby government to prevent that competition in the market or to otherwise restructure public policy to get more of those rents, right? And the problem with this kind of behavior is several-fold, right? Number one, often rent-seeking can hurt competition, right? As we saw in the case of the hair braiders, right? Or things like that. But another equally important problem is that rent-seeking moves resources away from productive activities. So the more time you spend rent-seeking, the less time you're engaging in other productive activities. Rent-seeking simply redistributes income from one group to another when effective, right? If you rent seek, right, correctly, right? Whereas if you engage in actual economic activities, you're making the pie bigger. And what we see is economies where the economic pie can be redistributed, when the percentage of the economic pie is attributable to government and there is more pie to be redistributed, we see as a really, it's an empirical question, right? And we see it a lot, that economies with lots of rent seeking fall below their potential. I mean, this is a consistent thing. We can view it across countries, cross-sectionally. We can view it within countries over time. Right? The data is pretty clear on this. And so economists worry about rent seeking from that level too. Have we seen that during COVID-19? Another way to look at rent seeking might be the idea of crony capitalism, right? And we mentioned this in a previous talk, but essentially, if you look at all of the CARES Act stuff, right, all of the small business coronavirus stuff, all the PPP loans, right, it wasn't necessarily the businesses that were doing the best for others that were getting these loans, right? And we knew that, right? We don't have the signal of profit and loss, as I've talked about in previous lectures, to allocate those resources efficiently. No, it was the best connected businesses that got all of this cash, right? And this isn't just limited to the US, right? Sometimes in other countries, there was lots of stories about coronavirus corruption cases, right? One person's rent seeking is another person's corruption in many views, right? And all kinds of data about what some people are calling the corona bailout, right? So taxpayers, right, us poor, rationally uninformed saps, as I told you guys before in previous lectures, are on the hook for about $6,000 per person in debt and spending from the CARES Act, whereas these individual taxpayers at best, right, got something like $1,200 or $1,800 a piece from this, right? And that $6,000 figure, by the way, also includes like kids, right, that didn't get the same transfers, right, from the government. So it's absolutely ridiculous, right, the amount of redistribution and inefficiency that has resulted from this. Also, at the very time that our economy needed to be putting resources into people coming up with innovative solutions, what we saw is a whole lot of people stopping, pivoting, and saying, okay, rather than how can I come up with an idea to work my business more efficiently, it's, all right, I got to figure out all of these government rules for how to apply for a PPP loan, right? I need to talk to my local banker, my local accountant, my local lawyer, and figure out, okay, how can I get these government resources rather than thinking about how to use markets to help others? And that really can hold our economy back. So a pretty huge failure, I think, that we've seen recently. So what does this mean as we put it all together? So I think it means that we need to look at democracy, right, the same way that we need to think about other things in markets. We need to analyze it critically. Democratic governments face real obstacles to allocating resources efficiently. So if we think that there are market failures that exist as a result of something intrinsic to a market, it certainly doesn't imply that government will do any better of a job, right? We at least need to recognize that just as humans, all right, run small businesses and things in markets, humans also participate in the democratic process. Right? And so understanding the strengths and weaknesses, right, of both democracy and markets is really important, I think, to understanding contemporary challenges to classical liberalism. So I'll do the same thing, though, that I did at the end of my market failure lecture, right? We asked the same question. So what are our options, right? Is there hope for the world? Can liberalism save us, given the bad news that I just shared? Well, the good news is I think there is, right? So I'm going to give you the same sort of hopeful outlook, I hope, that you guys might have heard of in other responses to crisis. So many of you might have heard, at least my generation grew up with Mr. Rogers and sort of this famous, right, children's TV show host. And in the middle of a crisis, he said, look for the helpers, right? Look for the heroes. in the midst of a pandemic. And the good news is there's some good helpers that we've seen in the private sector, right, swinging into action as a result of this pandemic. At the very beginning of the pandemic, while government was really still trying to get its act together, we saw plenty of private companies, philanthropists swing into action. Bill Gates was one among them that was has been very famous. He's been looking at vaccines and other things from a private standpoint for a long time through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? And so there's lots of ways that private companies have swung into action. We've seen all of a sudden parents looking at homeschooling or private schooling as potential options that they never did in other places, right? By forcing to be schooled at home, which was admittedly a huge challenge, right, for many parents. All of a sudden, there was an increased ability to say, hey, right, maybe some private choices for education for my kids isn't such a horrible thing, right? And what we also saw, I can tell you guys this as an academic, we saw all kinds of private companies, particularly in education, swoop in to help parents, teachers, and other groups in areas that were much more effective than any government response. So much more important to me as a professor than any kind of government bailout check were companies like Cengage coming in and saying, hey, look, your students might need access to an online textbook. We're here for you. Here's some new materials that you can use. Did Cengage do this out of the benefit and goodness of their heart? No, right? Cengage did this because they want my business in the future, right? Do I care that that's why they did it? No, right? In both cases, I still received lots of help I otherwise wouldn't have. And we saw, right, as a result, I think, right, my hope is that relying on the private responses and the market incentives, the more we can do that, we're going to see innovative ways to work in the future, right? More flexibility, more ability to react to consequences on the part of businesses that we haven't seen before, right? So many health economists have been arguing for more flexibility in healthcare for eons, right? And we never thought we could do it. And now all of a sudden we're seeing telemedicine spring up. We're seeing all of a sudden people able to have more flexibility at their workplaces than they never could before because they had to, right? So I think if we think about having private individuals assist and allowing people to do what they do best, I do think there can be some hope coming out of this crisis without having to worry about some of the government failures that we talk about. So with that, I would love to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
So as always, whenever public choice comes up and questions about democracy, we always have a bunch of questions, and we have some good challenges and pushback here as well, plus some technical econ questions. So if you have other questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. So first, citizens are rationally ignorant and politicians are self-interested, and yet democracies are the freest countries in the world. That would suggest that democracy is the safest protection for liberal values. How should we square that with this talk?
Okay, so I think that's a great question and one I get a lot, right? So democracy might be the best alternative. There's people that disagree on this, by the way. The things I'm about to say are not widely accepted by everybody, okay? Some people think, you know, constitutional monarchy might be better, right? But democracy is maybe, right, one of the best alternatives we have to other things. It doesn't mean it's perfect, right? And so what I think we need to do is, if we want to have a democratic society, and if we think that democracy is, well, when we do see correlations between democracy and other types of liberalism, right? I would argue that we don't necessarily know from the data that that's a causal mechanism, right? So I think we need to be careful, first of all, to equate, we don't want to conflate correlation and causation here, right? It might be that for example, richer countries or wealthier countries that thanks to economic freedoms can afford, right, more democratic institutions and stuff. But we don't necessarily see that link all the time. But secondly, given that if we think democracy is the best alternative, it doesn't mean it's without these flaws. So what I think we need to do, right, is we don't necessarily need to throw the whole baby out with the bathwater. Some think we might, right? But what we could do is think about how can we help minimize the flaws that we see in democratic allocation processes, right? So if rent seeking is inefficient, right, and we don't like it, how can we minimize the amount of rent seeking that we see in a society? How can we do things like, I argue that this is an example for minimizing the role of government in the first place, right? Making that rent-seeking pie smaller so economies can grow and we see less of those inefficiencies, right? So I think my personal view is that there is some role for democracy, but we need to be really careful and analyze it with the same critical lens that we analyze, let's say, markets.
As I listened to this talk, it began sounding that government can't accomplish anything, but this doesn't align with the evidence. Professor Heller mentioned that other countries like South Korea did a much better job than the US when it came to COVID, but that required government investment in public health. So how is it that government still often does some good?
Okay, so good questions. Right? So I think from a comparative perspective, right, governments tend to have problems. I think the US case is a particularly bad case right now. Like, it's a perfectly wonderful example to show all of the problems with public choice, right? Like, y'all, it's bad, right? Look at the data on COVID, for example, and our government response, like, horrible. Right? And so yes, other governments are responding better, but that doesn't mean that there aren't also inefficiencies in those political processes, right? And sometimes some government responses, I'm thinking particularly of China, but other countries, really restricted individual freedoms, right, in order to make some of that pandemic responses happen. Like, so for example, China, for example, has a really, at least Beijing, has a real, and other big cities in China, have really amazing subway systems, right? For example, right? Really easy to use as a foreigner in there. I mean, they also have signs in English, which is helpful. But, you know, really amazing stuff, right? How does the Chinese government have this very clear, beautiful, straight subway system that doesn't have to curve around anything? Well, because when the Chinese government says we're going to put a subway line, right, through an area, they just move people, right? They say, you know what? You don't get this property anymore, right? You get to live somewhere else. Like, yeah, this is called totalitarianism, right? So we cannot look at some of those responses without weighing costs of personal and individual freedom, right? China, for example, is not politically free in many senses of the word, right? That whole Bill of Rights thing, it doesn't exist over there, right? So we need to think about trade-offs too in responses to the pandemic, especially when we think about shutdowns and other things. We might not want what some of those government responses have been.
What are some concrete ways we can make democracy more fair and less captured by special interests?
Okay, so it's hard, right? Because I just got done telling you guys, not that you shouldn't vote, right? I didn't have a normative argument. I had a positive argument. I'm saying your vote probably doesn't matter, right? You can decide if you want to vote for the warm fuzzies of the world, go for it, right? Get your little I voted sticker, right? Whatever makes you feel good. But given a classical liberal's inherent skepticism of the political process, it creates real problems, right, for advocating change, right, in a democratic process, right? So My view, and this might be a little too, I don't know, warm fuzzy or something. I think talking to others and education about how these issues work, to me, are intrinsically more valuable than lobbying like through a political process, right? So I have a whole lot of personal issues with things like, for example, I will not call myself a libertarian, right? To be confused with the maybe big libertarian party, right? I'm a classical liberal in many senses. So I think it's like things like what the IHS is doing, you guys being here, right? You guys talking to other grad students, because I got news for you guys. I went to a pretty mainstream graduate program myself at UNC Chapel Hill. Lots of those folks they had no idea who these Austrian economists were. Like, who's this Hayek guy, right? Is he from, right, Austrian, like from Austria? Like, what, who is this? What is this, right? And never had heard of there was no public choice class anywhere in my graduate program at all. So I think us talking about these ideas to other folks in a reasoned way, not in an aggressive, like, we don't have to be a-holes about this, guys, I think is one of the ways to strengthen democratic institutions by having a more educated populace. So I guess this is my big advertisement for the IHS, but I think I think just as I said with market failures, if we want to advocate change, we need to do it on an individual level. I think the same thing is true for government failure.
We have a couple responses that I'm going to combine. One uses political science data and the other uses, let's call it anecdata. This says the consensus among political scientists is that voters aren't entirely self-interested when they vote. How do economists respond? And the other related question was, don't most voters, including this questioner, see their vote as part of a bigger good, a bigger social whole?
Yeah, sure. And I probably agree that most voters aren't entirely self-interested, right? Especially when you can get off the hook, right? Like if in a market, right, I might be a little more self-interested, right? If I see a homeless person on the street, right? And I decide whether I want to give that homeless person money as an individual, well, then I've got to take out money, right, individually to give that homeless person money, right? But if I go into the voting booth, right, and I want to help that homeless person, right, and I have some interest to do that, I can now all of a sudden, I can use someone else's money, a little bit of my money from taxes, but like mostly other people's money to help that homeless person on the street. Well, sure, it's a whole lot easier, right, to feel warm and fuzzy toward humanity when you're using someone else's money to do it, right? So I think absolutely, it's not all about pure self-interest for voters, but we don't need that, right? So I can grant that political science argument completely and say that we still have self-interest that affects the democratic process. It doesn't need to be a 0 or 1 solution. And then what was the second? That was the political science data. What was the other question?
I think that they were saying that their sense is that voters tend to have some sort of good above and beyond their individual good when they go to the voting booth, right?
Yeah,
which would align with what you just said.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I also think thanks to rational ignorance and just how busy we are in society to research alternative issues, it's likely that there's going to be unintended and unseen consequences of a lot of things that voters do. They might really want to help people and it might not work out well. Price gouging laws, classic example of this. Minimum wages can be like this, right? We want to help the poor, so we think a minimum wage is going to do it. In lots of ways that can create cycles of poverty and unemployment that I really haven't gotten into, but I would love to talk to you all about later, right? So we see the easy solutions in the voting booth, a lot harder to see the unintended consequences, even if we have the best intentions at heart.
Okay, some more technical questions. So Eugene Fama does not believe in bubbles. Do you think that the notion of a bubble in a market is intelligible? You might also say who Eugene Fama is.
Yeah. So this is a sort of finance guy that talks about this and sort of a behavioral finance guy. But anyway, I think bubbles can exist, but unlikely. The way bubbles exist are often, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, and I feel like I'm about to beat a dead horse, but are often a result of some other intervention in the marketplace that we don't see, right? So, for example, people feel sort of two ways about something like insider trading, right? Some people feel like insider trading is inherently sort of wrong, right? Because someone's getting a unfair advantage over somebody else, right? This notion of fairness. But on the other hand, there's some research that says that insider trading can actually sort of prevent bubbles before they happen, right? If people have inside information about something being overvalued, right, they can use insider information to sort of correct that bubble before it happens. Then another side of that kind of coin says, well, that might create bad incentives on the part of companies, right, to engage in behavior in order to create that problem in the first place. So anyway, but I think a lot of things that we look at where we've seen previous bubbles that have sort of burst have to do with intervention that we didn't see before, right? So if we want to look at things like the housing bubble in 2008, which I'm realizing now was 12 years ago, so some of you were like 10, and I'm just gonna, it's gonna be okay. I'm gonna remember that. But anyway, a lot of that had to do with a whole lot of government subsidization of all kinds of different loan schemes, right? Mortgage interest deductions, lots of other things that created this hype in the market, right? That said, I remember I bought a house in 2006 and people were saying, you're throwing your money away by renting, right? Economists at big places thought this, right? Because why would you do that when you can get the mortgage interest deduction from the government? Why would you do this when, right, there's all these things, you're approved for a $300,000 loan as a grad student? Ridiculousness. Right? But that was a result, right, of other things coming into the market to create that bubble in the first place. So I think bubbles exist, at least in some sense, depending on what you think a bubble is and how it was created.
Can Professor Heller explain what a value-added tax is and how it differs from other types of taxes? What are the advantages and disadvantages of VATs?
VATs. Yeah, so VATs are, I'm trying to make this really simple. VATs are sort of essentially consumption taxes, right? Or sales taxes, rather than income taxes or some other way we might allocate goods and services. Sometimes people think that VATs might be preferable to other types of taxes because of the way they affect incentives, right? So usually, like a very simplistic way to look at this is we tax things we want to discourage, right? When you raise the cost of doing something, people do less of it, right? So if we, which is one of the reasons behind, paternalistic taxes like cigarettes and stuff like that, alcohol, whatever. But if we tax income, right, what do we want? In general, for market economies, we like people to produce income. So if we tax income, people might do less of it. Right? And there's bad incentive, especially marginal tax rates can be bad incentives. Right? So some people have argued for things like a VAT because you'll be more likely to tax, like we might be more okay with discouraging consumption than discouraging income production. I think that's an interesting point. We also see a lot of VATs in really tourist-driven economies, because the idea is that you'll tax the people that come in, and you'll see refunds for the people that stay, and maybe the people that come in are relatively price insensitive. But I think more than how we tax, it matters a lot more what we're doing with it. So the taxation scheme, yes, can create different efficiencies, and you might be able to minimize some of the incentive problems and what we call deadwood loss of taxes, depending on how you tax, what you tax, if you tax a fairly inelastic good versus elastic good. But at the end of the day, what you spend that money on and whether the marginal benefits of that exceed the marginal cost to society, it, to me, is much more important than the way we tax things.
Even left-leaning economists, and they mentioned some names here like Stiglitz and Piketty, agree that rent-seeking is a massive problem. Why then is it so hard to build coalitions to address these rent-seeking issues?
Yeah, so I think in many ways, two reasons, right? Number one is this sort of special interest, like just kind of inherent to democracy itself, and it sucks, right? Is that there's going to be, for certain types of issues, there's going to be lots of incentive for some folks to sort of be pro rent seeking for their specific issue, right? And even though you might know, right, from sort of a social benefit perspective that rent seeking is bad, you individually don't have a whole lot of incentive to band with your friends and lobby against it, right? And you're busy in your lives, right? So some of it has to do with rational ignorance and just the way that democracy is set up. But, oh, I forgot I had another answer to that and I forgot the other one. But in general, oh gosh, I wish I could remember the other half of this argument. But anyway, I think in general, I think of it, I'll come back to it, but I think that's in general one of the ways that we sort of don't see that coalescing. But I would support, for example, private like lobbies against corruption. Oh, I remember one of the things I was going to say. The second thing I was going to say is I think we don't talk to each other enough, right? So if you guys were at my wealth and poverty lecture, and you guys are going to think I might be weird about this, I think like the old Occupy Wall Street movement and the sort of classical liberals have a lot to talk about, right, in terms of crony capitalism. Just like I think the current Black Lives Matter movement and the liberty movement have a lot to talk about, right, in terms of, hey, you want to defund the police? Cool, we might want to abolish them. Like, let's talk about this, right? And so I also think we need to somehow, as a society, get back to much more civil discourse and looking at alternative views and talking to each other. And then maybe we could see some of that happen.